what are we talking about when we talk about social enterprise? And how do I look at it from a hybrid perspective? I try to make this short as I'm blasting through my time. I will first give you a first preliminary definition of what social enterprise is, at least how we in this webinar are going to use the term. I'll talk shortly about organizational hybridity as the general characteristic of social enterprises. And I will also shortly talk about the potential role they can play in public service provision. Social enterprise is a very interesting term. And as we will see later on with the presentations by the three speakers, a multifaceted phenomenon, but it also is marred in conceptual confusion. So it's very difficult to give one general definition of what social enterprise is. Because as Teasdale, for example, also stated, social enterprise is a fluid and contested concept constructed by different actors promoting different discourses, connected to different organizational forms and drawing upon different academic theories. But nevertheless, for the purpose of this webinar, it is important, I guess, to at least have a working definition of what a social enterprise is. And without wanting to add to the confusion, I suggest that for the purposes of this meeting, we define social enterprise as a combination of economic and social welfare creation, as Mayer and Marty also do. And perhaps we can also agree that social enterprise takes place in an organization which then can be called a social enterprise. And what is a social enterprise? Well, perhaps we can adhere to the definition of that the European Commission is using based on the Amos definition, that a social enterprise is an operator in the social economy whose main objective is to have social impact rather than to make a profit for their owners and shareholders. It operates by providing goods and services for the market in an entrepreneurial and innovative fashion and uses its profits primarily to achieve social objectives. It is managed in an open and responsible manner and in particular involves employees, consumers and stakeholders affected by its commercial activities. So there, in a nutshell, if you look at the parts of this definition in bold, you see at least some of the characteristics of a social enterprise. The organizational form in which the activity of social enterprise, of social entrepreneurship is taking place. And just to illustrate what kind of organizations we are then talking about, we have the so-called WISE, work, integration, social enterprises, organizations that help people who have perhaps less chances on the regular labor market to find labor opportunities. And here you have some pictures of such social enterprises in the Rotterdam area of the Netherlands where I live. Organizations which main purpose is to help people in the regular labor market who have or with problems in the regular labor markets to find job opportunities. So now that we know how we could perhaps define a social enterprise, and as said before, it's a working definition, I would like to quickly talk about what my perspective is on social enterprise. I'm very much interested, I'm a scholar in public administration, very much interested in hybrid organizations. I will say something about that shortly later on. And over the last years, I've also become interested in social enterprises. I'm engaged in research on social enterprise on the one hand as being a member of Empower SE, which is like a group of international scholars in whole of Europe looking at social enterprises, also organizing very interesting activities. I invite you to have a look at the website. I've also contributed 2 chapters to a book on social enterprise in Western Europe, which will be published in February by Routledge. And I'm also just finishing up, and this is what you see here on the left-hand side, a contribution to a report by the OECD on how to boost social enterprise in the German state of Brandenburg. And what I find very interesting in social enterprises is that their organizational hybridity is their general characteristic. Because we already heard that it's very difficult to give a definition of what a social enterprise is. There are very different definitions, but at least I think we can agree that they're all hybrid organizations, as they all straddle, cross, model, and even integrate boundaries between for-profit and non-profit and occasionally public sectors. And by doing so, because they're sitting on the fence, so to say, because they're at the interface of these different worlds, they are combining institutional logics of state, market, and civil society. They mix, in other words, the general interest, which normally is a task of the state, with the capital interest that you find on the marketplace and the mutual interest that you find in a mutual society, in the civil society. And if you have an understanding of social enterprises, hybrid organizations in that sense, then you can also distinguish between different forms of hybrid social enterprises, as de Fourny and Nissens are doing it in this figure, where I now don't have time to really go through, but what they are showing is that depending on which corner of this triangle organizations originate, you find different types of social enterprises. There can be organizations which are more from the market realm, or more from the capital interest realm, more the state realm, or more from the world of mutual enterprises, but they're all are social enterprises because they have become hybrid. And that makes that you also have different types of hybrid organization, social enterprises as hybrid organizations. I invite you to read the article by de Fourny and Nissens, which is very illuminating on this point. So social enterprises are hybrid in the sense that they mix different institutional logics, and that has, of course, effects on the organizations and on how they provide their services. The hybridity can be a positive thing. It can induce and stimulate innovation. It can help an organization to get access to more, to new resources, financial, but also when it comes to people. And it can also bring together people with different various supplementary backgrounds, so that again, synergy is created. But the hybridity of social enterprises can also be a risk, as it can lead to ambiguity, mission drift. It can also block out resources, and it can lead to cultural clashes. So being a social enterprise is not only good, the hybridity of the social enterprise brings opportunities, but it can also lead to risks. So it's a mixed bag. And that also makes, and that's a second thing I'm interested in my research, that social enterprises can be a weird organizational form within conservative, corporatist welfare states, like the welfare states that we find in countries like the Netherlands, but also Germany and Belgium, which are based on the subsidiarity principle, in which the state plays a role, but the state does not necessarily have to provide all services, public services by itself. In these welfare states, like in the Netherlands, social enterprise is not necessarily a new phenomenon, because we see here a long history of service provision through other actors, other organizations than the state. But we also see a rise of new style social enterprises, what could perhaps be labeled as social startups, organizations which are mostly rather new and which have been established with the aim to create social impact, mostly based on the more US and UK narrative of social innovation, which they are linked, much more than with the more third sector narrative than many of the more traditional public service providers in conservative corporatist welfare states are established with, which I would also say are also somehow social enterprises if you take the European Commission definition of them. And because we have now a new wave of new social startups, issues arise in welfare states such as the Dutch one. On the one hand, there are issues in a relationship between traditional service providers and social startups. There's a lot of discussion also about whether the rise of new social startups leads to a commercialization of social welfare through maybe a phenomena like social washing, but there are also issues with governments, as governments in these countries often still are funding agencies and regulators of organizations providing public services. And nowadays, more and more often, those are social enterprises or organizations that label themselves as social enterprises. And my last sheet is the public administration perspective on social enterprise I have when looking at these organizations, as governments ask me and other public admin scholars how to react to the rise of social enterprise, the rise to organizations that now call themselves social enterprises in the Netherlands and in other conservative corporatist welfare states. Do we need new legislation for these organizations? Do we perhaps need a new legal form for these organizations? Should there be preferential treatment for social enterprises in public procurement? What of course doesn't make it easier is there's still a lot of question on how to define social enterprise, which criteria make a social enterprise, and how to measure the impact of social enterprise. How to relate how do these new social enterprises also relate to more traditional service providers, to more traditional organizations that we find in the social economy? Now, those are the questions I have. Luckily, as I'm totally out of time, I do not have to answer them right now, but I hope that the three speakers in their own presentations will at least give a beginning of an answer to these questions of governments, and I think also of a lot of you people who have joined our webinar.